I'm Chuck Fall, the president of the Truth Action Project, also known as TAP, and I will be your host tonight. We welcome you to our forum, Campfire. Our forum tonight, it is on Gaza and the Palestinian-Israel conflict, America's funding of false flags, endless wars, and ethnic cleansing. We are honored to have with us our special guests, Alison, Weir, Richard Gage, and John Spritzler. I will make introductions about them in a moment. Let me just cover some basic housekeeping. We're going to asking our guests to have their mics muted. Presenters will each go for 30 minutes or so, and then we will have Q&A. We all have strong ideas about Israel and Gaza, but we expect people to be respectful. And during Q&A and in the chat, we will be strict about enforcing respectful communication. You will be muted or removed from the meeting if disrespectful. Please turn off your video and stay on mute unless you are called on during Q&A during our event tonight. Please like us and share our events on social media platforms that you use. And you can find the links in the advertisement to make those social supports. And so for a disclaimer, just to be clear that the views, thoughts, and the opinions expressed tonight are the speakers and not necessarily represent the views and the thoughts of Truth Action Project. The material and information presented here is for general information and educational purposes only. The Truth Action Project name, forms, and abbreviations are the property of its owners, and its use does not imply endorsement of any opposition or support of any organization, product, or service. Before we get underway, we want our guests and audience to know our mission is about networking for a community hub of truth seekers. We aim to be a support organization, not just for 9/11 truth, but for medical freedom, stop the WHO power grab, among other struggles. TAP strives to give thought leaders fiscal and media support by way of TAP's platforms to showcase their work, exposing the big lies, and aims to inspire and promote action by the truth advocates who support them in their efforts. TAP is a bridge that can connect us all, and there is strength in numbers. When we bring in the greatest minds together, we can come up with solutions and goals that can make all of our combined efforts effective and powerful. But in order to provide the technical and media support our partners and others require, we need your help to build a team that demonstrates respectful dialogue and consists of creative thinkers, writers, forum hosts, marketing and technical directors, video clip creators, social media managers, and more. If you think there is a fit for you, or if you can find niche in TAP, please let us know. You can go to our info at Truth Action Project or communicate to us on the chat tonight. Okay, so I'm going to just quickly just give you a quick overview. Alison is our first guest. She's the founder of If Americans Knew, and I'll let her make a brief introduction about herself and then give us a report, and you'll have a PowerPoint that you'll share, and you'll share screen. Next will be Richard Gage, leader in the truth movement, and he'll address the parallels between October 7th and 9/11. And Richard could make an introduction for himself. And then finally, John Spritzler, egalitarian, will speak on what an egalitarian theory applied could do to make sense of all of this. So I am going to turn it over to the first speakers. Alison, we're going to put I could put the spotlight on you so that you can just give us an introduction, and then you'll share screen, and then you will give us the report. So just say hi to everyone, and what name your organization and introduce your report, and then when you're ready, share the screen,
Sure.
and then you'll go into your show. Please.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm very excited to do it. I hope use the technology properly. That's always a challenge. I'm the founder and executive director of If Americans Knew. Our goal is to give the facts about Israel-Palestine to every single American that we possibly can, of every background and political background. We feel that eventually, when people know the truth, they will work for policies of rationality and morality. I'm also the president of the Council for the National Interest. So I'll tell more when I give my talk.
Okay, well then let's go ahead and have you share your screen and set at your PowerPoint, and then take us through your report. And is that coming through, Trina? There you go.
Okay, this is just our mission statement, so I'll move on. I'll be talking tonight about Israel-Palestine before October 7th. I think that's the most important thing. Many people finally in the last 6 or 7 or 8 months have focused on an issue that really has been around for a century. So I'll give a little bit of that background and some of my research. In fact, the beginning part of this will be a talk that I traditionally gave before around 2018 or 2019 to show you what it was like before. You know, the media suggests that everything started with the attack on Israel on October 7th. That's how many people view it. So let's look at what was going on before that particular day. We often hear about Palestinian rockets. They always tell us thousands of rockets have been fired from Gaza, but they almost never tell us that these are in a large majority of cases homemade rockets that usually don't even cause any damage, much less fatalities. At the time I was doing this, about 5 years ago, they'd killed a total of 30 people in all the time they've been used. They began in 2001. So in all those years, that was about 20 years at that time, they had killed a total of 30 people, but people are never told that. Now the number is 54 total during that entire time. So fair-minded people would want to know, well, how many Gazans have been killed by the equivalent by airstrikes? And at that time, a few years ago, it was 5,700 Gazans. So news consumers would hear about thousands of rockets, but not be told 30 people. And they would never hear that Israeli airstrikes had killed almost 6,000 Palestinians already at that time. We hear about Israeli children when they're killed. These are the numbers as of 2012. But we almost never hear about the Palestinian children who were killed during that time period. And people are not told that in the round of violence that began in fall of 2000, 91 Palestinian children were killed before a single Israeli child was killed. And in fact, I counted up those numbers. The number one cause of death of those Palestinian children was gunfire to the head. My view is that every single one of those deaths is a tragedy. Every Palestinian child, every Israeli child is a tragedy. These were the numbers as of 2014. This is the number now. So you can see, it used to be that, I'm not sure if you can see this right side of my screen. I can't actually see it myself, but I imagine you're seeing a very high column for 2014. Well, look at how small 2014 looks now. Many people wonder why I became involved, since I'm not Jewish or Palestinian or Arab or Muslim. Israel partisans like to claim, therefore, I must be an anti-Semitic. Apparently, if you're not Jewish or Muslim or Arab, you're not supposed to pay attention. But what happened with me, and I didn't pay attention for most of my life. That's actually true of most of us. But in fall of 2000, the second Palestinian uprising began. And my youngest child had just started for college, so I had a little extra time. I was a small town journalist at that time. But I got curious about what that what it's called is an intifada, which means an uprising. So I became curious about it and I started following the news coverage. And very quickly I noticed that the news coverage was very one-sided. As a journalist, I noticed that we would hear from and about Israelis in great detail, as we should, as I wanted. But I noticed we almost never heard from and about Palestinians, certainly not in the equivalent detail. So journalists, when we think we're seeing a cover-up, get more and more interested. So I began following it more and more. And finally, after a while, it began to seem to me that this was the most covered-up issue I had ever seen. And I was not young. I had seen many cover-ups of all kinds, and this one had lasted longer than I felt any other cover-up had lasted.
Alison, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you please, ma'am, raise your voice just a little? I've gotten messages in the chat. They're having a hard time hearing you. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's good to let me know. So this particular cover-up was both on the left and on the right. Usually it's either the left is covering up something or the right is covering up something. Both do it. In this case, both were covering up this issue. So after a few months, I decided to quit my job in Northern California and travel over to the region as a freelance reporter. So in February and March of 2001, I went to Palestine by myself. As I landed, I was a little nervous. What was I doing to go there right in the middle of a violent uprising in a region where we're always told is dangerous for Americans and for women? What I found is that people were welcoming. I traveled randomly throughout Gaza and the West Bank. I'll just show a few of the pictures I took on that trip. And the people invariably would say to me, welcome. I would interview people. I was there as a journalist. So, and remember, keep in mind, this was February and March of 2001, before 9/11. But I also saw this. This was the Tufa area of Khan Yunis in Gaza. This is in the news now. This is what it looked like in 2001. These are my photos. These were family homes. I would see people with mattresses on the floor in the middle where they hoped they would be safe and their children would not be killed as I went around this area. Keep in mind, this was before a single rocket had been fired from Gaza. The media and the Israel partisans, which are often one and the same, consistently tell us that, well, Israel is defending itself from rockets. Well, no rockets had been fired at this time. Children would gather around me and they would show me handfuls of spent bullets that they had gathered. At one point, when we were walking through this area, there was suddenly gunfire very near where we were. We all ducked and went away from that area and tried to stay safe. In Gaza, I saw beautiful, and in the West Bank, but especially Gaza, I saw beautiful agricultural lands that were being destroyed intentionally by Israeli forces next to the beautiful blue Mediterranean Sea. I talked to farmers who had farmed there forever, and their farms were being destroyed. I remember thinking, what would they do? What does a farmer do when all of his crops and his orchards are destroyed? I wondered, how would they feed their children? And this was before it got bad. Then I knew by then that many children had been shot by Israeli forces. So I found that it was my job, I felt as a journalist, to see them. And all I had to do was go to the nearest hospital. And I saw children with bullets in their backs, in their chest, in their head, in their teeth. I saw one little boy who was brain dead. Then I went up to the West Bank. I went to a newspaper office. This, I believe, was in Ramallah. And they had sandbags against the bullets that Israeli forces shoot at newspaper offices. You know, shooting journalists is not new. Israeli forces have been doing this for a very long time, and it's documented. It's just that the media didn't tell people. I went to one home where a little boy had just been shot and killed. I saw the wall hanging over their door that said, "God bless our home." They'd moved in just recently to their dream home. This picture, this wall hanging says, "Thinking of God makes our hearts grow calm." It had a bullet hole in it. I was there when the family got home, the parents and sisters got home from the hospital. And I heard the weeping and the weeping and the weeping. And I saw the father walking around. It looked like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that would never end. And then I went to the funeral. There were funerals pretty much almost every day. There was a funeral. This one was for a mother who had just been killed walking home from the market. She had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12, and this was a neighbor who told me about her friend. She said her friend had been hoping that her son, her 18-year-old son, wanted to go to college in America. This woman told me that she said to me, it's the dream of every boy in Palestine to go to college in America. But she said, of course, he won't go now. He'll stay home to help with his brothers. And then at that time, there was no wall yet. But then I went back a few years later, and there was a wall imprisoning the people, especially in Gaza, but also the West Bank is a prison. You cannot get in or out without going through Israeli armed borders. The group has controlled Gaza and the West Bank for decades. This is what it looks like to get out of Bethlehem when they allow you out, which often they do not. Then when I went back to Gaza, I think this was about 2019, these are places where I had seen lots of people before. American International School in Gaza, destroyed by Israeli shelling. As I said, I believe this was from a trip in 2019, long before October 7th. When I returned from that first trip, I began an organization called If Americans Knew. We conducted media studies because I think, personally, the most powerful institution in our country are the news media. That's how everybody learns what they think they know about many issues, especially international issues. We've done a lot of studies by now, but here are a few of them. We would look at how they covered deaths among both populations. That's quantifiable and everybody recognizes as significant. We looked at which deaths got were in the headline or the lead paragraph. And we found in the first year of the current uproar, we also looked into a subcategory, children's deaths, because most of us feel that's wrong. Israeli partisans defend it, but most people think it's wrong. So how many children were killed the first year of that uprising? These were the numbers. 28 Israeli children tragically killed, 131 Palestinian children tragically killed. How is this covered by the media? Well, they covered Israeli deaths at rates up to 14 times greater than they reported on Palestinian children. To most people, Palestinian children's deaths were invisible. I remember I was in Los Angeles at one point. There was a headline on their website that a period of calm had just been shattered. This was before the paper had been printed, so I tried to call them to correct that headline because I told them that during that so-called period of calm, 170 Palestinians had been killed, men, women, and children. 379 had been injured or maimed. I called the newspaper and we said relative calm, and they didn't change a single word or include any of this information. There have been so many omissions through the years. There is dissent in Israel. There are rabbis for human rights. There are Israelis against torture. There are sometimes soldiers that won't serve in the occupation. But again, we almost never hear of these people. There's been a nonviolent movement for many, 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 many years. And these people are often shot. They're always beaten. I went to some of these, and you're always beaten. Some people are shot. Some are killed. Rachel Corrie was killed. Tom Herndl was killed. This young woman was just beaten badly by a Jewish extremist who said, "We killed Jesus and we'll kill you too." Another omission is the USS Liberty. 2003, there was an independent commission that reported on Capitol Hill. It was led by Admiral Thomas Moore, a 4-star admiral. Also involved was Rear Admiral Merlin Starring, who had been head of the entire legal department of the U.S. Navy. Also on their commission was the highest-ranking Medal of Honor recipient in the United States, Marine General Ray Davis. They announced their findings on Capitol Hill in a public event. They said that Israeli forces had tried to sink a U.S. Navy ship, that they had killed 34 people, injured over 170 crew members, and that they had been ordered by the White House to recall planes, rescue planes that had gone to help these men were recalled by order of the president. And this commission announced that this was covered up on behalf of the Israel lobby. Then again, I'll tell about some of the, at that time, were recent Israel-Gaza wars. Remember, this is information from about 5 years ago before the current one. Let's look at these wars. The media always called them wars. So here was 2009, I believe it was. 9 Israelis were killed, 1,400 Palestinians. Is that a war? That's not what a war looks like. That's what a massacre looks like. Then in 2014, there was another one. In this case, the media told us it was because of 3 young Israelis who had been abducted, because they always start whenever Israelis are injured. That's where the clock starts ticking. But let's look back at the beginning of the year all the way through. Let's look at both populations. They both matter, not just one. So beginning in January, it actually turns out that Palestinians had been killed, including a child, but they never would mention that. February, more Palestinians were killed. February, in March, even more, another child was killed. In April, there's 1 Israeli soldier and another Palestinian. Then in May, we have 2 Palestinian children and another Palestinian was killed. All of these were before that, the so-called starting point. Here we get the starting point, the 3 Israelis. And then that's what it looked like. This was 2014. As I mentioned, they always talked about the 3 Israelis who had been abducted, just like now we always hear about the hostages. Well, let's look at both populations again. Let's consider the fact that both populations matter. There were 3 Israelis. There were over 2,000 Palestinians. So then I began to look back at the history. How did this happen? Where did Israel-Palestine come from? Why does the U.S. have a special relationship with a tiny country that has almost no natural resources? How is this an ally for the United States, which we're constantly told it is? Sort of an absurd position. So I wondered where that came from. I found out that when I was born, and maybe some of you, there was no Israel. Keep that in mind. There was Palestine. It had been called Palestine for centuries, and there had not been violence during much of that time. There were Muslims, Jews, and Palestinians. It was approximately 80% Muslim, about 15% Christian, and about 5% Jewish, all living together. Then in the late 1800s, a political movement began called Zionism. The goal was to create a Jewish state on Palestine and dispossess 95% of the inhabitants. So what is the U.S. connection? Well, it turns out that there was a Zionist movement in the United States beginning at the same time, the 1880s. By 1898, there was the first annual conference of American Zionists. By 1910, there were 20,000 Zionists in the United States. They included lawyers, professors, businessmen. This was before even my parents were born. It was already becoming a movement to which Congress listened as they do now in 1910. There was a very significant occurrence when Louis Brandeis became the head of World Zionism. As many of you know, this was a very respected Supreme Court justice. Well, it turns out there was even, I was shocked to learn that, but it's well documented if you know much about him, which I had not. People know he was a Zionist and he headed the World Zionist Organization for a period of time. But I learned even more, and I'll give you my source for this particular one. If you get my book, everything is sourced. I read a book by, I read dozens and dozens of books. And one of them was a very mainstream book by a very mainstream author, the New York Times editor and author, Peter Gross. He published a book by a mainstream publisher, Knopf Publishing. So this is a very mainstream source. And in that book, he said that, go back to this, he said that Louis Brandeis had been a leader of a secret Zionist society operating in the United States. I, of course, looked at that footnote, as I always do, and I found that this well-regarded historian and journalist, his footnote was mainly an article by a Jewish scholar named Professor Sarah Schmidt. It was published in the American Jewish Historical Quarterly in 1975. She's an expert in Jewish history and especially Zionist history. She also has a book that tells more about it that I've read. She said that this was an elitist secret society that was started in the United States. It spread out across the land, and there was even an induction ceremony in which each person, when they entered this society, swore that they would hold this society more important to them than family, school, or nation. Then the next part is very significant to explain. It turns out that in 1915, a member of this organization, Horace Callan, he was a professor at the University of Wisconsin at that time, suggested to the British that they would benefit from issuing a formal declaration in support of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. This was suggested in 1915. Now, to most people, that would not make much sense because the British, huge as the British Empire was, it did not control Palestine at that time. Palestine was under the Ottoman Empire. So what was happening in 1915 that would make this relevant? Well, it was the Great War. Britain was fighting a war against the Ottoman Empire. If they won that war, they would then be in charge of Palestine. So some British Zionists, Chaim Weizmann in particular, went to the British government and said, "We will help you bring the United States into this war on the side of Britain, if you will then help facilitate our project to create a Jewish state in Palestine." They told them that through our Zionist brethren in the United States, especially Brandeis, who's very close to Woodrow Wilson, we can accomplish this. They claimed that. They told that to the British. At that time, the American public was what is called isolationist, or we might call it anti-war. They didn't want to join that war on either side. There were many German Americans, many English Americans. Woodrow Wilson was elected with the slogan that he would not, that he would keep the U.S. out of the war. But then he plunged the U.S. into the war. So then they got the Balfour Declaration afterwards that some of you may have heard of, when the Zionists promised that basically under the Balfour Declaration, which was issued to Lord Rothschild. Basically, it just said we will sort of facilitate having Jewish colonization in Palestine. I'll skip through some of this. The precursor to today's AIPAC. All of this, of course, is the beginning of the Israel lobby in the United States. But there was one organization that was directly related to AIPAC, the American Zionist Emergency Council. This originally had a budget of $500,000 at a time when a nickel bought a loaf of bread, and it eventually had access to a much larger amount of money. And it used the money well, just like today. They targeted congressmen, Christian clergy, editors, professors, businesses, and labor, and Jewish war veterans. The whole population had to be propagandized because, for one thing, most Jewish Americans were not Zionists. They had no interest in the Zionist ideology or movement. They were happy where they were, so they were propagandized along with Christians and everyone else. All of this I can go into more detail later, but during this time there was significant opposition to Zionism during these decades. Christian leaders opposed it, the State Department, the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, all opposed the Zionist movement, as did Jewish anti-Zionists. Two of the most distinguished clergy opposed Zionism on religious grounds. One Dead Sea scholar wrote a wonderful book called Palestine is Our Business, in which he argued for the rights of Palestinians. But he was called anti-Semitic for writing that book and effectively canceled. Elmer Berger and Alfred Lilienthal were Jewish anti-Zionists who were very active and also failed at opposing Zionism. What surprised me was when I discovered that the U.S. governmental establishment was against Zionism because some of them, they issued memo after memo, study after study, report after report, all opposing it. Most often on strategic grounds, but some of them specifically said this is against the principles that our nation is supposed to stand for. These are some of the people that made very strong statements against the Zionist movement. George Marshall, who was the famous General George Marshall of the Marshall Plan, was Secretary of State under Truman. He told Truman, "I won't even vote for you if you sacrifice U.S. interests for the sake of an election." But Harry Truman, like every politician, felt his election was more important than the needs of the nation, or than justice. So then, after 1947, the British, who had been in control of Palestine all that time, turned it over to the United Nations to solve. This is where we always hear about the wonderful opportunity that the Arabs turned down. Well, let's look at what that partition plan was. It consisted of giving about 55% of Palestine would be taken away from Palestinians and given to a Jewish state. And the Palestinians would be left with about 45% of their own land. But that didn't create Israel. That was in a General Assembly recommendation, and it never went to the Security Council, so it has no force of law whatsoever. Many people say the UN created Israel, but it did not. What created Israel was a war of ethnic cleansing. As an excellent Israeli historian, Ilan Pappé, says, it's very valuable to read his book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. They drove out probably 750,000 men, women, and children. Could have been more. Nobody knows how many died during that time. Some people, most of the journalism then was very embedded with pro-Israel partisans, often in the Israeli fighting. But there were some that tried to tell people what was actually going on. One was named Dorothy Thompson, who was, the Britannica calls her one of the most important journalists of the 20th century, and yet I had never heard of her. Well, she had been very famous. She had a radio program listened to by millions of people. She had a column that was read. She was considered by many people the most powerful woman behind Eleanor Roosevelt. There was even a Broadway play and a Hollywood movie loosely patterned on her life. Dorothy Thompson had been a foreign correspondent in Germany before World War II and had raised the alarm about the Nazis. In fact, she was the first journalist to be expelled by Hitler. So she was sympathetic to Zionism. But then she went to see what was actually going on, and she discovered what was going on, and she began to write and speak about that. And for telling Americans about these people, she lost her job, she lost her fame, she lost her career, and she was silenced by the media. As her biographer put it, she was erased from history. So after Israel successfully established itself through that war of ethnic cleansing, the problem is that there were all these Palestinian refugees in the surrounding countries. And the surrounding countries do not benefit from having penniless refugees in their midst. Plus, they do see that a huge injustice has just occurred. So the surrounding countries were potentially enemies to Israel. So Israel had plans that, well, they had to maintain their power and keep the refugees out. And the way to do that would be to damage every single country around them. They wrote about this early on. In 1954, there was a diary was published in Hebrew, and then some of it was published in the United States. Revealed that Ben-Gurion had a plan to partition and subordinate Lebanon and Egypt and other countries in the region. So that was already being written about in the 1950s. Then later on, there was another plan, the Oded plan, which was to ensure regional superiority, dissolve Syria and Iraq. And they pointed out that every kind of inter-Arab confrontation would be useful for Israel. So the goal was to fragment the Middle East, break Egypt down. All this was spelled out in great detail. I have this on our website. You can read the details. Then in 1991, General Wesley Clark, some of you may have heard of, he spoke on Democracy Now!, and he also gave a speech at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. And he told about the neocons who had arisen to power. And in 1991, Clark said he had met with Paul Wolfowitz and Louis Libby, two of the neocons who pushed the U.S. into the Iraq War. And they said the U.S. at the end of the war should have an opportunity to clean up Syria, Iran, and Iraq. They were already targeting those three countries, even though those countries had nothing to do with the U.S. In 1996, there was a clean break, a new strategy for securing the realm. This was a position paper written by Americans for Netanyahu. The idea was to shape Israel's environment. They targeted Syria, Iraq, and Iran. This was a document and a plan created by a group that was led by Richard Pearl, who was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for a foreign government. These are some of the members. As General Wesley Clark pointed out, the Project for a New American Century had committed a policy coup. He said that they had taken over U.S. policies. He said that also on Democracy Now! I'll just skip through some of this because I know I shouldn't spend too much time. But as Clark pointed out, the neocons wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down. Not just destroy Iraq, but do more than that. And they managed to do it. We invaded Iraq and destroyed that country at the behest of these pro-Israel neocons. This is very controversial to point out in this country, but in Israel it was written about openly. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz, a major daily newspaper, wrote in 2003, the war in Iraq was conceived by 25 neoconservative intellectuals, most of them Jewish, who are pushing President Bush to change the course of history. Pearl Feith and their fellow strategists are walking a fine line between their loyalty to American governments and Israeli interests. This was in Haaretz. And then we had the Iraq War. I'm sure many of us remember that war. And as the one newspaper pointed out, the destruction of Iraq led to ISIS. Many of the ISIS leaders had been in places like Abu Ghraib. So then Syria, which was long targeted by Israel, was the next to be damaged. Sorry. A WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, who's being persecuted, has been given us a great service by exposing so many things. One of them is that Hillary had written an email saying the best way to help Israel is to help the people of Syria overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And so Syria has been destroyed. And as The Guardian pointed out, the disorder and chaos sweeping through the region would not be an unfortunate side effect, but a sign that everything is going according to plan. So then there are refugees from Syria. And now there have been tragedies in Europe, Belgium, France. But before that, there's this little, that's a French victim. Here's a little boy from Syria. And before that was this little boy from Gaza. And now Iran has also long been targeted. This newspaper advertisement was published in the New York Times in 2010. I happened to be in New York then and saw it in the paper. Demonizing Ahmadinejad. And then in the bottom, they put in the logos of the people who had paid for that advertisement, that anti-Iran advertisement in 2010. So I looked up who those groups were, and here they are. These are the groups that were all publicly and openly, usually it's behind the scenes, were demonizing Iran and getting it set up for the next attack. But there are Iranian children that play on beaches too, and maybe we can stop them from getting killed. All of our studies are on our website. My book has full citations for everything. There's information about Dorothy Thompson. So thank you for giving me so much time.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. We're gonna digest that, and that was an amazing report. And I think we're gonna not do any Q&A. We're gonna flip right into Richard Gage. So you can, Trina will cause you to stop sharing, Alison. And yeah, what a foundation you just gave us for understanding. And what really comes up for me is the call to somehow find resolution. For right now, though, you entered 9/11. Richard is going to pick up the 9/11 baton and tell a story and give a report, and then we're going to go to John Spritzler, and we'll break into Q&A and try to start making sense of what we're hearing. So thank you, Alison. Richard, the ball is in your court, and if you want to make any initial introductory remarks, please do as you see fit.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you. And thank you, Alison, for that very, very special and touching and eye-opening and cringy report, an insight into the reality of what's happening over there. I just wish this could be a special on CNN. Good luck with that. We have a long road to hoe here. I'm Richard Gage, AIA architect, founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and the former CEO thereof. I now work full-time with my wife at our new organization, Richard Gage 9/11. And we don't want people to be the last to know about what really happened at 9/11 and, of course, now what's happening with Gaza. And so I was shocked to find that the parallels between these two major events are extraordinary. In fact, they're so numerous. I found about 20 of them. There were outcomes from both of these events, politically, economically, and geopolitically, that forced these radical changes. The question is that I've been asking is, were these intended outcomes, or did they just happen as a result of the attacks provided to us in the official narrative? To answer that question, we have to look for patterns and connect the dots. So many, fortunately, in the truth movement in its widest sense have done that, particularly you, Alison, and I will be adding to this presentation significantly as a result of your knowledge and information there. So let's ask questions fearlessly, again, as you have just done. What follows these types of events? Well, there's a common denominator, war. And what triggers war? The war trigger system was expounded upon by the late Professor Graham McQueen. And he found that false flag events trigger wars. What are those? A political or military action that's made to appear to have been carried out by a group that is not actually responsible. That's in the Cambridge Dictionary. This is now mainstream lexicon. What is less mainstream is its evolutionary son, state crimes against democracy. SCADs often appear, Lansty Haven-Smith tells us, where presidential politics and foreign policy intersect. SCADs differ from earlier forms of political corruption in that they frequently involve political, military, and/or economic elites at the very highest levels of the social and political order. So what are some of the features of SCADs? Do the events of 9/11 and Gaza share any of these features? Well, we found that in the Hegelian dialectic, they create the original problem, and they do that in many of these ways we're going to be looking at today, and we will go through each of these: geostrategic goals, recent provocations, controlled patsies, an innovative attack, an intelligence failure, a military stand down, foreknowledge of the attacks because they're planned in advance, uncontrolled delight during the attacks. We'll look at the dancing Israelis. Then they manage the public reaction to the attack with government and media propaganda, atrocities that are alleged with dehumanizing then the enemy. The denial of such atrocities, it seems to come because they're often made up. Denial by those who they are alleged against. Media and journalists are targeted. They then prescribe the solution to the problem now that people are in a frenzied state to accept the giving up, for instance, of their freedoms for security. There's a military revenge attack that's been built up by the media and taken over by the military. Occupy the territory of the new enemy, widening the conflict to achieve those original broader goals. Regime change, a forever war policy is often enacted, with billions flowing to the media, banking, and war industries, extreme censorship of the public by government, mainstream media, and social media now, draconian policies and surveillance instituted by governments, malevolent roots more than 250 years old. We'll take a look at that as we complete this epic project, which is as yet to be completed. So let's look at how they create the problem. Often, as we mentioned, false flag attacks. Even Wikispooks actually defines false flag attacks, as does Wikipedia. There's a rich history of such attacks that are enumerated in Wikispooks. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, particularly, the storming of the Reichstag in Germany. The Gulf of Tonkin, of course, is what started the Vietnam War. The London bombings are an example of false flag attacks. We won't be going into those today. Of course, the Ukraine war with the coup in 2014. 9/11 we'll be looking at in some detail today, as we will with Gaza, which isn't on the map here yet. The Achille Lauro hijacking, Operation Gladio, for instance, with the Bologna bombing, the JFK assassination, of course, the Lavon affair, the Oklahoma City bombing. The Lavon affair is a classic example that's been made quite public, an Israeli false flag attack. Oklahoma City bombing is clearly falls into that category. And then we have the Pan Am Flight 103 and other flights which have been bombed and blamed on others. The Russian apartment bombing in Russia, they have their own brand of false flag attacks, starting the Chechenian War. And the Syrian chemical weapons attack is a famous example, which has been widely debunked, even partially in the mainstream media. Of course, the USS Liberty incident, in which Israel attacked an unarmed American ship that was clearly marked. The underwear bombing has been exposed as being just that as well. So we jump into the first parallel, which is the greatest portion of our presentation today, with previously established geostrategic goals coveting the natural resources of the territory. In the case of 9/11, we have the neocon think tank that Alison mentioned, Project for a New American Century, wherein they posted on their in their website a paper highlighting their goals for regional hegemony in the Middle East and a vast increase in the Pentagon budget. But they exclaimed, the process of change is likely to be a long one, absent a catalyzing and catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. And President Bush writes in his diary that night, today we had our new Pearl Harbor. These are the individuals in question that Alison was referring to who changed, were the neocons who changed policy, historic policy, and got us into these wars. This is all documented in their paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Now, interestingly, these gentlemen, most of them found their way into the Bush administration when he came into power. And so we have Afghanistan. Why would we be in Afghanistan? Well, one example of the fact that this was a plan is the fact that the plans were signed by Bush the day before 9/11. This was supposed to be a surprise attack. Why are we in Afghanistan then if it wasn't a response to 9/11? Well, could it have been the empire of drugs that was being coveted? So it took the most sophisticated intelligence system in the world more than a decade to find the perpetrator of 9/11, allegedly Osama bin Laden. Was he used to run cover for a much more profitable operation? i.e. coveting the specific resources of this country, such as the opium production. Because before the Taliban seized control in Afghanistan in 1996, the profits from the opium cultivation through the chain of dope netted 400 to 500 billion, exceeding the profits of all the oil companies put together. Afghanistan exported 3,300 metric tons per year. After the Taliban took over, however, things changed. They shut down the poppy cultivation to just 185 tons, a decrease of 94%. Apparently, they were looking to grow food instead of drugs. I don't know. That's a speculation. The U.S.-led invasion removed the Taliban, and almost immediately the poppy yield skyrocketed back to 3,400 metric tons in 2003, exceeding 180 billion per year, and rocketed then to 6,100 metric tons in 2006. Why are we in Afghanistan? Well, guess what? It didn't last long. Actually, it was the longest lasting war in our history. But after 14 years, the Taliban kicked us out. What happened to the opium production after we were kicked out? They shut it down yet again, reducing the production by 95%. Does this give you a sense of what was really going on in Afghanistan? The UN numbers and the ALSIS numbers highlight this very specifically. We have something else going on, however, in Afghanistan, a gas pipeline. In fact, in the late 90s, Afghanistan found itself caught between the two massive geostrategic realities. Countries to the north became rich from new natural gas discoveries, and at the south, they were starved for natural gas. So what do we have to do? Get the gas from the north through Afghanistan to the south. UNICAL signed agreements for this 36-inch gas pipeline in 1995, and with an intention to bring that gas all the way into India, where hundreds of millions of energy-starved people are. But this required agreements with the Taliban. And so agreements were signed to allow the pipeline to pass through their country. All good, right? Not so good. There was a delay by UNICAL. Taliban took the opportunity to negotiate agreements with, I think it was Brazil or Argentina, a new deal to get gas to Pakistan from Turkmenistan. And so the U.S. retaliated on them. We imposed sanctions. In a final meeting with the Taliban, there was an ultimatum. Either you accept our offer of a carpet of gold or we will bury you under a carpet of bombs. Apparently, they accepted the carpet of bombs because that's what they got. In Afghanistan, there was another ultimatum. After 9/11, they were threatened with war if they didn't turn over bin Laden. Taliban offered to do that. Give us the proof, they asked. President Bush says, what? There's no need to discuss it. We know he's guilty. Just turn him over. There's nothing to negotiate about. They're harboring a terrorist, and they need to turn bin Laden over. We know he's guilty? Well, what did Cheney say in 2006?
So we've never made the case or argued the case that somehow Osama bin Laden was directly involved in 9/11. That evidence has never been forthcoming.
So the evidence was good enough to go to war, but not good enough for court or international negotiations with integrity. So what was it that we were in Iraq for? Was it weapons of mass destruction? No. Was it ties to Osama bin Laden? No. Was it something else? Let's see what it might be. Iraq is a focal point regionally for international security issues. It borders, of course, Iran. 9/11 afforded the opportunity to surround Iran with U.S. military power, a goal of the neocon think tank. But could Saddam be fingered for 9/11? Well, they failed miserably, but they invaded them anyway. And so what else is in Iraq? Well, maybe 140 billion barrels of oil reserves, the world's second largest proven set of reserves, and 110 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. This is significant. In fact, CNN in 2013 said, before the 2003 invasion, Iraq's domestic oil industry was fully nationalized and closed to Western oil companies. Not after we invaded them. A decade later, it's largely privatized and utterly dominated by foreign firms. You don't mess with these people. Or if you do, you better not be Saddam Hussein or the Taliban. How about in Israel? Do they have their own set of geostrategic goals? The Gaza conflict did not begin on October 7th, as Alison so eloquently highlighted. There's an early vision, the greater Israel and the Rothschild family and the creation of this country. It was known as Palestine under the British occupation. In fact, the Romans named it Palestine. It's been Palestine since the Romans conquered it. From the 14th century then to the 20th century, it was primarily Muslims and Christians, with just a 2% Jewish population. They lived peacefully together under the rule of the Ottoman Empire during this time. Following World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell, though. What happened? The British became the controlling power. It's called the British Mandate. The growing, I don't know who named it that, the growing desire for a national homeland for Jewish people began to escalate, with tens of thousands of Jews emigrating to the area. Violent conflicts ensued between local Arabs and Jews. And even back as far as, in the very early 1900, a Jewish political activist, Theodor Herzl, is credited as the father of modern Zionism. So it kind of started back then. He influenced many Jews to emigrate. We must, what did he say? We must expropriate gently the private property on the state assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it employment in our country. This is a theme that started more than 100 years ago. Didn't start after the creation of Israel. That statement and many other statements, of course, by Zionist leaders make it readily apparent that the transfer of the Palestinian Arab population, along with the accompanying apartheid policies, seem to be inherent in Zionism since its inception. Furthermore, the territorial ambitions of the Zionists appear to have exceeded that of Palestine alone. Herzl says the area of the Jewish state stretches from the Brook of Egypt to the Euphrates. Look at the red boundary. This is a theme that continues today in Israel's leadership. It didn't die with the early statements like this one from Herzl. So what do we have? Jewish settlers climbing to about 11% by 1917 and rising to 30% by 1945. The British monarchy eventually yielded to increasing pressure calling for a Jewish homeland and signed the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to Lord Walter Lionel, 2nd Baron Rothschild, in return for his promise to pull some heavy strings in order to bring America into England's losing war with Germany. World War I, through another false flag operation, the sinking of the Lusitania, which sparked that war. Importantly, it stresses in the declaration, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestinian. Palestine. I don't think anybody read that one. Of course, immediately there were harsh reactions from Palestinian Muslim community and in fact, Arabs all around the world. This will have as a result the replacement of the Arabs by the Jews, one of the leaders of the community so deeply affected, stated. And Rothschild, in a startling set of admissions, acknowledges his family's role in the creation of the Balfour Declaration. So there's quite a potent reaction. The UK government should hang its head in shame. Britain had no moral or legal right to promise Palestine to the Jews as a national home. The concept of national home does not even exist under international law. Avi Schleim says the absurdity of the Balfour Declaration in denying national rights to the 90% majority and granting it to the 10% minority. This University of Oxford professor states, one nation, Britain, promised the country of another people, the Palestinians, to a third people, the Jews. Just think of how absurd this is. It's one of the most improbable political documents of all time, says Jewish author Arthur Kessler. Gaza says, the Balfour Declaration is only 67 words long, yet it launched what is broadly seen today as the world's most intractable conflict. And you can see why. In black, you have the Jewish-controlled areas. In 1946, before the UN plan, which, as Alison mentioned, is not even legal, never was, what made Israel was a war. In yellow, we have the Palestinian-controlled areas. You can see how they vastly diminish, particularly following the Six-Day War. As Alison pointed out, it is war how these territories were expanded. They seized not only most of the remaining Palestinian territory, but also a significant portion of Syria to the north with the Golan Heights and Egypt to the south with the Sinai Peninsula. Today, Israel is in control of nearly all of Palestine, as you see on the right, colored in black. So the problem can be seen in a perspective that you will never see in mainstream media. This left Israel as the occupier of these territories, and occupiers do not have the moral or legal right to occupy. That's the definition of occupation, one of them. So what are the strategic goals then of Israel? The Greater Israel constitutes the cornerstone of powerful Zionist factions within the current Netanyahu government, the Likud party, as well as within the Israeli military and intelligence establishments. This is an operating parameter, as you'll see. An Israeli strategic plan to ensure Israeli regional superiority. It insists and stipulates what? That Israel must configure its geopolitical environment through the balkanization of the surrounding Arab states into smaller and weaker states. This comes from the Yinon plan. There it is, of 1982. A continuation, actually, of Britain's colonial design in the Middle East. Israeli strategists have called for the division of Iraq and into a Kurdish state, into two separate Arab states, for instance, one for Shiites and one for Muslims. The first step towards establishing this was a war between Iraq and Iran, which was facilitated and manipulated by the West and Israel. The Yinon plan also calls for a divided Lebanon, Egypt, and Syria. The meddling has no end. Disillusion in North Africa also, and forecast it starting from Egypt and spilling over into Sudan and Libya, where there's massive political troubles and wars. Recall also the Wesley Clark revelation, which we'll actually be coming to, the takedown of 7 countries in 5 years So we have to connect the dots. Who is running American foreign policy? Alison pointed out that dual citizens from Israel are embedded as a great majority in the neocons who were brought in by the Bush administration. Back to David Ben-Gurion, former prime minister of Israel, we will expel the Arabs and take their place. In each attack, a decisive blow should be struck, resulting in the destruction of homes and the expulsion of the population. This is not ambiguous. This is the prime minister, formerly of Israel, and almost every prime minister has made such statements. Here's Golda Meir's statement. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. It's not as if we came and threw them out and took their country. They didn't exist. What does it say in the founding document of the Likud party? Their original party platform, security and peace. Therefore, Judea and Samaria, which includes Gaza and the West Bank, will not be handed to any foreign administration. Between the sea and Jordan, from the river to the sea, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. Again, this is not unambiguous. So from early on, in modern times, it becomes a problem, such that The Nation magazine says it's time to confront Israel's version of from the river to the sea. This is not an obscure document. Everybody knows about it who does their homework. Previous language about flattening Gaza, the New York Times. It's part of the normal Israeli discourse to call for Gaza to be flattened, erased, or destroyed. The New York Times is exposing this. The newspaper quoted one retired IDF general as having proclaimed, Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. These statements are not made by isolated extremists, but by senior members of Israeli government, like the finance minister of Israel today, who said what? No such thing as the Palestinian people. And he's speaking on a podium with a map of what? The greater Israel. Provoking, of course, international outrage. Watch. I'm not making this stuff up. So the greater Israel appears not to be just a historical aberration that the Israels outgrew following statehood, but a goal that has consistently guided their actions: invasion, occupation, annexation, in spite of the words of peace to the international audience. What could their real goals be based on in Gaza? Do we dare look at the natural resources, gas, 122 trillion cubic feet of which was discovered over 2 decades ago, including 71 billion in oil, total worth about $453 billion in profit, especially in the wake of the U.S.-sponsored sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. Quote, the ongoing Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip cannot be viewed in isolation from the rich natural gas resources that abound on its shores. And this is true. In fact, the Israeli Energy Prime Minister says the Memorandum of Understanding will enable Israel for the first time to export Israeli natural gas to Europe. Problem, it wasn't Israeli natural gas. It belonged to the people of Gaza, and that's a real problem. But she continues, it is even more impressive looking at the significant set of agreements we signed over the last year, which position Israel and the Israeli energy and water sectors as a key global player. She's not kidding. Dr. Kabursi from McMaster University says the deposits have gained notoriety and value as Russian gas and oil supplies become less available and accessible by Europe through sanctions. It's all manipulated. And so we have Israeli occupation continuing, preventing the Palestinians to develop what? Their energy resources. Dr. Kabursi, economist professor, says the Palestinian people have been denied the benefits of using this natural resource to finance socioeconomic development and meet their need for energy. The accumulated losses are estimated in the billions of dollars. So Israeli occupation, but Israel has now started selling what? Exploration rights to fossil fuels, which belong to who? The Palestinians. Within 6 days of October 7th attacks, they sold 12 licenses to 6 different companies. They couldn't do this without their created mass outrage until there was a dehumanization of this population. So when Joe Biden's Energy Secretary Amos Hochstein visited Israel last week to push for the development of Gaza's offshore gas reserves, he claimed that the move will revitalize the Palestinian economy. Of course, these are just words and carry no forthcoming actions. United Nations issued a stunning report on this subject, the economic costs of the Israeli occupation for the Palestinian people. The unrealized oil and natural gas potential. The total oil and gas reserves were valued at a staggering $524 billion in 2019, but Israel does not have sole legal entitlement to that, according to the report. So they're taking a stand of sorts here, and this is why Israel continually, one of the many reasons, distances itself from the UN, but uses it as cover when they have a nation to claim, though artificially created. So let's jump to the other major resource coveted here in Gaza, as it turns out, the Ben Gurion Canal opportunity, a replacement for the Suez Canal, named after their former Prime Minister, David Ben Gurion. It was conceived in the 60s after Nasser nationalized the Suez and had control over it. That was a big problem for the West in general. It would be a third the length longer than the Suez Canal, 150 miles altogether, 2 times its depth. And so it would allow for bi-directional traffic and even an aircraft carrier going one way. Named after, so we learned that Israel would net about $6 billion annually from this canal, twice the aid that we provide them from the U.S. Major Western investors would reap even greater profits. So they're involved and invested in the problems associated with the canal building that have to be overcome. What are those? The land of Gaza now becomes 3 to 4 times more valuable than in recent decades, especially given that Israel is planning to build small towns and tourist hubs with hotels and restaurants along the canal. The situation will shake the strategic energy balance of China's Belt and Road Initiative in the Mediterranean, along with the Strait of Hormuz, through which 30% of the world's energy is transported. So this is an international incentive to compete with China, which is about to, through this initiative of theirs, take over a whole lot of trade. The East Med pipeline plays into this as well. It's positioned at the mouth of what? The new canal, allowing oil tankers to empty their loads coming from the Strait of Hormuz at the to be developed port near or in Gaza, we'll see, and then turn around and head back down the canal to the oil-producing countries where they came from. They no longer have to sail all the way to these destinations in Greece and Italy and Cyprus. This is a huge deal in international politics and economics. So right now the ships have to wait in line at the Suez Canal. It's a terrible thing. There's millions and millions of dollars monthly that go into dredging the Suez Canal to keep it going. So what are they going to do? How are they going to build the Ben Gurion Canal? They're planning on using nuclear weapons for peaceful purposes. It's not unheard of. Project Plowshare was an official U.S. program organized in 1957 for using nukes for peaceful purposes. Tests demonstrated that atomic bombs can be used for peaceful purposes. There are consequences: tritiated water and the deposits of fallout from radioactive material being injected into the atmosphere. Problems that solutions weren't readily available when this plan was created, but may or may not be now. We don't know. But they planned on detonating a nuclear bomb every 1,300 feet along this 150-mile stretch. This is a plan developed by Lawrence Livermore Lab and H.D. Maccabee put it together. And this is in the late 90s. So they have some sense that it might work, at least. It's the most controversial document, of course. The U.S. Department of Energy sponsored it. It was classified until 1993. So this document, 1996, was simply when it was received. So I don't even remember when this started. But we have a canal that would be a strategically valuable alternative to the current Suez Canal, they concluded. Its cost, though, would be $16 to $55 billion as estimated back then. This may be in the 70s. I don't really remember. There are two routes for this canal. One we saw earlier, which goes north of Gaza, and there is speculation that it might need to go through Gaza. Why? Because running it parallel to the Egyptian border allows excavation through the armor rock structure instead of the desert sand, eliminating billions per year in dredging the canal from the frequent sandstorms, an enormous financial burden currently to the Suez. So that would save 50 miles of excavation, a third of its length. But of course, this would not be acceptable to Gaza or the international people, the international community, absent what? A catalyzing and catastrophic event, like something like a new 9/11, which we seem to have gotten, at least that's what they call it, on 10/7. Also, they couldn't run it through Gaza, even with the complicity of the Gazan people, because what? It would face rockets and so forth, being in such great close proximity to the shipping canal. It's a security risk they couldn't have. Who says this? In times of war, it's best never to focus on emotions or sides, but rather to follow the money. So we're looking at the money today with an objective approach. And we're looking at what the leaders of Israel say. Massive population migration, natural and necessary. Who says this? The Minister of Intelligence, Gila Gamliel, in 2023, a few days before 10/7 even. a forcible and permanent transfer of the Gaza Strip's 2.2 million Palestinian residents to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. They're actually saying these things. This is actually per official document revealed in full for the first time, a 10-page document in 2023, published on October 13th, 6 days after the 10/7 events. They outline the framework of the current war. It's in the framework of the current war, and they recommend a full population transfer as its preferred course of action. It also calls on Israel to enlist the international community in support of this endeavor. The document is dated just 6 days later. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, could this detailed 10-page paper with highly specific recommendations involving years of research, in all likelihood, could it have been developed and passed through multiple channels of approval it had to have gone through in such a short amount of time, 6 days? No, we see this all the time. This is like the Patriot Act. It was rolled out within weeks after 9/11. Of course, it's an incredibly complex document, so many pages that the Congress in this country couldn't even read it. So these things are telltale signs of a false flag operation. This is the document here. You can download it today. What does it say? It's a policy paper. Options for a policy regarding Gaza's civilian population. Had to have been created, again, before 10/7. Option C, what does it say? Will yield positive, long-term strategic outcomes. Okay, what's option C? Due to the fighting against Hamas, there's a need to evacuate the non-combatant population from the combatant area. Israel should act to evacuate the civilian population to the Sinai. The population, not Hamas, the whole population. In the first stage, tent cities will be established in the area of the Sinai. The next stage includes the establishment of a humanitarian zone to assist the civilian population of Gaza and construction of cities in a resettled area in the northern Sinai. A sterile zone will be created. They have operational objectives that are just as startling. So what is the overall strategy here? We have significant population displacement, they said significant population displacement may present, however, challenges in terms of international legitimacy. No kidding. The understatement of the decade. In fact, the forcible transfer of populations violates Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and is prosecutable as an international crime. Since international crimes of Israel during the past 75 years are so well documented, can we imagine that they'll find a way to make it happen in spite of international law? They seem to be, right? And massive political pressure, which they're getting from everywhere but the U.S. government. Under the cover of what? An instigated wider war with their Arab neighbors. This is almost necessary for them to complete their objectives in Gaza, as well as we've heard, the objectives outside of Israel. Their Arab neighbors. After all, Israel has done this before. Under the cover of the 6-day war, preemptively started by Israel, of which the sinking of the USS Liberty was an integral component, or the attempted sinking. They invaded not only Gaza, but the West Bank too, thereby occupying all of Palestinian sovereign territory allocated in the 1948 UN non-legal plan. And they have managed to keep control of it for the last 57 years. They also annexed, of course, the Golan Heights in Syria and the Sinai in Egypt. So they've done these kinds of things before. It's a pattern. The puppet masters have pulled the strings and the puppets are dancing. Who are the puppet masters? We'll have to get to that one in parallel number 22 of this series. What parallel are we on? Parallel 1. Michelle Chossudovsky cites, is the U.S. using Israel for imperial control, or is Israel using the U.S. for its territorial ambitions. We've got a lot of work to do, and I need a timer. Who knows how far into the stretch we are?
Richard, now you've just covered the first parallel, but you have 20 parallels. Is that correct?
22, actually.
So there's no way that we would be able to accomplish all of those this evening.
No, but I'm going to tell you what they are, but you have to tell me how much time I have.
Well, why don't we should probably be you're working toward the close, the wrap up, I would say.
I will close at 40 minutes. How many minutes do I have until then?
You want to take another 8 minutes?
Thank you. That's helpful. So false flag operations are how these things are conducted. In the U.S., we have a string of them, as you can see here. We don't have to go through them. We're all familiar with them, but they will be added in some great detail to the presentation and during the next week. In Israel, we have another string of them. What are they? The bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. Benjamin Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's father, dressed up like a Palestinian and planted bombs in the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 and injuring 46. This is publicly known. It's documented in Wikipedia, for goodness sake. The Lavon affair, another well-documented, publicly known and recognized false flag event in 1954, where a group of Egyptian Jews were recruited by Israeli military intelligence to plant bombs inside Egyptian, American, and British-owned civilian targets, multiple targets. The USS Liberty, an unmarked ship, was attacked, and it was covered up. The attempt was to sink it. More than 100 people were killed, almost that many injured, vice versa, actually. Who said this? I don't give a damn if the ship sinks and all the Americans are killed. I will not embarrass my ally, said who? President Johnson. When? When he was outed by a whistleblower who is the commanding officer in the Air Force, who was asked to not let the fighter jets get through to help the Liberty because one of its signals, only one, was received, the others being jammed by the Israelis. So it's really bad. And if Americans knew who's responsible for this wonderful piece of journalistic efforts, our own Alison Weir. Israeli attack on the USS Liberty is no accident, says who? Jesse Helms, famous senator. So we look at Mossad agents dressed up to deceive leaders of ISIS. And this is confirmed. This, in fact, aiding and abetting ISIS is a part of the strategy, says Israeli ex-IDF chief. We've supplied ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and FSA with weapons and funding for years. They're on record as admitting this.
In a shocking change of policy, now former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot revealed on Sunday to the British Sunday Times newspaper that Israel has indeed been supplying weapons and funding to Syrian rebel groups in the Golan Heights.
So, what did the U.S. Army say? Of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, the SAMS officers, U.S. Army, wild card, ruthless, cunning, have the capability to target U.S. forces and make it look like a Palestinian Arab act. When did they say this? On September 10th is when this report came out. One day before 9/11, they're warning us about the Mossad and instigating false flag attacks against America. So we have many, many provocations by Israel that we will go into when we have more time. We have patsies, parallel number 3, politically useful foreign operatives with a history of violence developed by the state. And this includes Osama bin Laden, who was developed by the CIA, codenamed Tim Osman. Lethal anthrax hidden in letters of attacks.
Richard, may I interrupt you? What I think we should do at this point is, if you would scroll through, just hit the parallels, because we're not going to have time to go into the details. What you are prepared is encyclopedic, and really needed a dedicated, evening. And let's just scroll through, and then we're going to jump to John, and then and we can go over, and we're not hard fast, but let's take that prompt. Richard, scroll us through some of the, and then make your synthesizing kind of wrap up of what is the takeaway for us tonight.
Thank you, Chuck. Okay, let's do that. Parallel number 4 is a triggering event, an innovative attack with dubious origins, a manufactured invasion from foreign operatives. And we have many testimonies for such. Parallel 6, a military stand down with an obvious uncharacteristic delay in response, such as all of the 41 drills that we have evidence of. Parallel 7, foreknowledge of the attacks. We know about it in advance because we have so much knowledge, including, by the way, IDF officials who said to this woman before the attacks that they were going to happen, and that there would be a stand down. Dancing Israelis during the Twin Towers destruction, we're familiar with those, but also during the attacks by the Israelis, dancing as their country's being attacked. We'll get into that. Parallel 7, foreknowledge of the attacks with insider trading. Proof that there was massive foreknowledge. Then we get into section B. They manage the public reaction with parallel number 9, propaganda with outrageous slogans from government and media to manipulate the public emotion with crisis actors deployed. And we have parallel number 9.5, false official accounts with no real investigation. We have parallel number 10, atrocities that are alleged to the enemy with ensuing dehumanization. 11, denial of those atrocities by the enemy. 12, opposition media and journalists that are targeted. 13, a military revenge attack prepared in advance with orders of magnitude greater than the original attacks. And 14, occupying the territory of the new enemy. This is the land grab. 15, widening the conflict to achieve those broader goals. And 16, effect regime change of the enemy leadership. 17, enacting a forever war policy. Parallel 18, billions flowing to the media, banking, and war industries with serious conflicts of interest, with suspicious benefits for insiders. And 19, extreme censorship by the government, mainstream media, and social media. We have parallel 20, draconian policies and surveillance that are instituted by government. In the case of 9/11, we're very familiar with those, and it's coming out in Israel monthly. We have new ones. Parallel 21, malevolent roots that date back more than 250 years that we'll be tracing. This is what we are getting to, and we have a huge problem, and we can't take on this problem at the level of the problem. It's not really an information war as much as it is a spiritual war. So we have to do a lot of work on ourselves, in our communities, locally, and discover who we really are. Because once we do, we realize that we're not trapped in the matrix with agents, demons, and vampire energies They're trapped in here with us. And that's a perspective that's empowering. And that's where I think we have to begin. And of course, there's a whole lot of work to do following that.
We have our campfire on Friday, and basically this conversation continues. And what's been represented by Alison and yourself, and we're going to go to John immediately, is this immense problem of living in a world that's dominated by a plutocracy that effectively runs a war economy, and all the people in between are fodder. I'm going to get the spotlight onto John Spritzler, and he's going to, he has a criticism around how to object and how to debate and argue against the Israeli claim that annihilating Gaza is necessary to make Israelis safe. And I'm going to just go straight to John, spotlight you, and have you present. John, you have the spotlight.
Thank you, Chuck. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to come third after some very eloquent presentations. So my main concern as an egalitarian, trying to build an egalitarian revolutionary movement, is how do we win? Because I don't like to lose. So how does Israel and the United States get away with all of this enormous evil? You know, we've heard how it's over-the-top evil, it's illegal, it's violation of international law, it's cruel, it involves killing children in huge numbers. How do they get away with it? Most people do not support that kind of evil. Most people are good and decent. The ruling elites, the oppressors are not, but most people are. So how does a tiny minority of these rich ruling elites get away with such incredible evil? Well, there's a reason. And I think that if we're gonna win, we need to identify the reason that they get away with it so that we can refute it, defeat it. So I think one of the ways to see how they get away with it is to look at what Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir said. She was Prime Minister from 1969 to 74. This is what she said. We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us. Now, this is the Zionist big lie that explains why people should support Zionist cruelty against Palestinians. The argument is that, yeah, the Zionists, the Israelis, they really regret having to do it, but they have no choice. They have to do it to protect the safety of Jews in Israel. You know, and theoretically, Jews can't be safe except for Israel and so forth. So they have no choice. They hate doing it, but it's necessary. Now, this is a very persuasive argument. I don't mean it persuades me, but it persuades a lot of people, obviously, and especially because in the West, in the United States and the Western countries, we're very, very familiar. We've been made very, very familiar with the fact of the Holocaust. And people, to their credit, are horrified by the Holocaust. And they don't want to do anything that goes against what Jews must do to make themselves safe. And that's why it is a fact today that in spite of television media showing the enormity of the genocidal violence in Gaza, it is still the case that a majority of Americans support Israel, with misgivings about the current genocidal violence. So you have people, over the top Israel supporters like Robert Reich, who recently came out with a video saying, well, yeah, we should support Israel, of course, but conditionally now, not unconditionally. And supporting Israel, of course, means supporting the violent ethnic cleansing project, all of the atrocities that it's been. That's what supporting Israel means. And people support Israel because they're convinced that the Israelis are only doing what they have to make Jews safe, and that if you don't support Israel, then you're opposing what Jews have to do to be safe, and that is objectively, in effect, anti-Semitic. Not necessarily anti-Semitic by intent, but objectively, it's anti-Semitic. And people don't want to oppose what they think is necessary to make Jews safe. Now, I want to contrast the situation with apartheid in South Africa. As we all know, there was a very successful movement in the United States and other countries against apartheid in South Africa. It was so successful that it won the support in the United States of the vast majority of the public and ended up forcing the US government, against its will, to do a 180 and switch from supporting apartheid in South Africa to condemning it with sanctions. How did the movement against apartheid in South Africa win, whereas the movement against Zionism in the United States is failing? It's not getting the vast majority of the public support the way the movement against South Africa did. Why is that? Well, the reason is that there was no persuasive argument for Americans in support of apartheid. You didn't see people demonstrating in support of apartheid in the United States. But there is an unfortunately persuasive argument in support of Zionist violence against Palestinians on the grounds that it's necessary to make Jews safe. But the problem is, if you don't refute the Zionist big lie that says Zionist violence against Palestinians is necessary to make Jews safe, if you don't refute that lie, if all you do is say, well, it's immoral, it's terrible to kill so many children, it's immoral to commit ethnic cleansing, etc. If that's all you say, you're not refuting the Zionist lie that persuades people to support Zionism. And that's the reason why a majority of Americans still support Israel, because they have never heard a refutation of the Zionist lie that Zionist violence is for the purpose of making Jews safe. So what I'm going to talk about now is why that's a lie, so that we can then go forth and tell the public it's a lie. Let me give you an example of the effect of telling the truth about the real purpose of Israeli violence is that it has absolutely nothing to do with making Jews safe. Here's an anecdote. So I used to work at the Harvard School of Public Health, and I collected signatures there with some other people supporting the right of return of Palestinians. And a Jewish colleague of mine named Michael, who I had to work with, he came up to the table His muscles in his face were trembling in anger. Literally, I saw them trembling. He put his finger right at my nose. He said, "John, you're that close to being Hitler," which I interpreted as a hostile remark. I thought he was going to punch me in the face. I was just getting ready to get punched. I was sitting down. He was standing up. Well, he didn't punch me, but he came that close. The next morning, I ran into him at the cafeteria. And we were colleagues. We had to work together, you see. I said, "Michael, can I have a word with you?" So grudgingly, he said, "Okay." I then proceeded to tell him what I'm going to tell you. For about 15 minutes, I went on and on. He was dead silent. He thought I was an anti-Semite, but he was shocked to hear what I was saying that proved otherwise. That week, I showed the wonderful film Janine, Janine to Harvard School of Public Health students, advertised it with flyers and so forth. And it's a wonderful anti-Zionist film about the brutality of Zionism in the town of Jenin. So I showed this film, and I didn't expect Michael to show up for it, and he did not. But as I was leaving the showing of the film, walking back to my office, lo and behold, in the hallway comes Michael. And he's approaching me, and he's all smiles. He's all smiles. He said, "John, I couldn't make the film because I had a meeting I had to go to, conflicting with it. But if you show another film like that, I'll be sure to go to it." Let me tell you just one more anecdote. I have a neighbor. She's my age, 77. When I first met her, she was very, very pro-Israel, passionately pro-Israel, like Michael. She had an Israeli flag on the window of her apartment facing outdoors. She's even like a third or fourth cousin of Sheldon Alison, the Israeli billionaire who died a few years ago, who actually took his large family to two big events, one of which was his birthday, another was a bar mitzvah, wined and dined them all on his dime. He took Sharon, my friend. It was the most exciting thing in her whole life, in Singapore and Las Vegas on the other occasion. So I showed her my article about Israel, which says what I'm going to say to you tonight. And she read it. She is now an anti-Zionist, like I am. So I called this to your attention as the reason for what I'm going to say being important. So I have an article that I wrote that is going to be in the chat, or already is in the chat. Trina put the URL up. It's called October 7th and 9/11, same purpose. So I'm going to use it as the basis for making the following remarks. The events of October 7th, 2023 in Israel and September 11th, 2001 in the United States both benefited ruling billionaire classes of Israel and the United States, respectively. The U.S. billionaire ruling class obviously used the 9/11 attack as a pretext for launching its mass murder, so-called war on terror against governments of several Muslim nations, but also as a pretext for further clamping down on the have-nots of America itself with legislation such as the Patriot Act. And additionally, very importantly, making Americans put on hold their various struggles against the ruling class on the grounds that it was not now patriotic to oppose the government. This suggests that 9/11 was an inside job, and specific evidence for that supposition makes it even more certain. Likewise, regardless of what Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu did or did not know in advance about the particulars of the October 7th Hamas attack, and yes, there are good reasons to suspect that he knowingly helped to make it happen, the important fact is that the Israeli billionaire ruling class has, for many decades, been using the ongoing Palestinian violence against Israelis, of which the October 7th Hamas attack is only the most recent, as a pretext not only for attacking Palestinian civilians, most recently in Gaza with genocidal violence, but also as a pretext for clamping down on the Jewish have-nots of Israel, the Israeli Jewish working class, and making them put on hold their struggles against the Israeli ruling class on the grounds that opposing the government is not patriotic. In Israel, it is 9/11 almost every single day. I make the following four-part assertion about how and why Israel's rulers for many decades have been working to ensure that Palestinian violence against Israeli Jews would occur. And when I say many decades, I want to point out that those decades, 7+ decades, precede the discovery of natural gas and plans to make, a new canal and so forth. Not that those are not important motivations, but I don't think they're the fundamental explanations for what's going on. Israeli Jews were manipulated to make them view the Israeli government during these 7 decades as their protector against a supposedly existential threat. In exactly the same way, Americans were made to view the US government as their protector against a supposedly existential threat on 9/11 and during the following years. The rulers of both nations used fear of a boogeyman enemy to control their own population, a population of have-nots that had many major grievances against the ruling class, and that, if not controlled, constituted a threat to remove those ruling classes from power. I provide here a sample of the overwhelming evidence for this assertion. Much more evidence, all based on mainstream sources, is in the other articles of mine that are linked to from the article I hope that you'll read, that it's on the chat. So here's my assertion in 4 parts. Part 1, the actual rulers of Israel are billionaires and the generals and politicians beholden to them. The rulers are not religiously motivated. They are and have been either atheists or agnostics, as were, for example, the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, the president of Israel from 1949 to 52, Moshe Dayan, Israel's most famous general, Israeli prime ministers David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Netanyahu, and no doubt many others. The actual religious belief of these Zionist leaders has been characterized this way, quote, God does not exist, and he gave the land to the Jews. The purpose of Israeli violence against Palestinians has never been to make Israeli Jews safe, not at all. For the actual billionaire rulers of Israel and the politicians and generals beholden to them, as opposed to ordinary Israeli Jews and religious fanatic Jews, the true primary purpose of 7+ decades of Israeli violence against Palestinians, by which I mean violent ethnic cleansing, denial of the refugees' right of return, brutal and humiliating military occupation of the West Bank, violent enforcement of apartheid laws inside Israel. Its purpose has been this. It is to make Palestinians as angry at Israel as possible, and thereby to make them a boogeyman enemy that the billionaire ruling class of Israel pretends to protect ordinary Israeli Jews from, in order thereby to get away with severely economically oppressing working class Israeli Jews, including Holocaust survivors, to get rich off of the Israeli Jewish working class. I have proven this with mainstream sources in the articles I point you to. In this sense, October 7th was, for all intents and purposes, an inside job, even if its exact timing and nature were not known in advance by Israel's rulers. I'm not saying they didn't know in advance, but even if they did not, it would still be an inside job, essentially. Class conflict within the Israeli Jewish population is real, even though its significance for understanding the deeds of the government are unreported. Israel's billionaire ruling class oppresses the Israeli have-nots, including the Jewish working class and including Holocaust survivors. And now I'll just read one little example of the kind of evidence for this. The New York Times reports August 5th, 2007, quote, from Jerusalem, quote, several dozen survivors of the Holocaust, supported by hundreds of younger relatives and supporters, marched in protest today in front of Prime Minister Ehud Olmert's office, saying that a planned government stipend was too small, insulting both the living and the dead, carrying signs that said, "Let us live in dignity." The demonstrators demanded that Mr. Olmert issue a formal statement revoking a government decision to provide a stipend next year of 83 shekels, or about $20 a month, to the country's Holocaust survivors. A few wore yellow stars of David, reminiscent of the ones the Nazis forced Jews to wear. But many wore black T-shirts with the words in yellow, quote, "The Holocaust is still with us, the survivors," unquote. Okay, there's a lot more evidence, but I'm not going to read it for lack of time. I want to now go on to make the next point, which is that the Israeli working class rose up against the billionaire ruling class in Israel in 2011. The Guardian reported, quote, Israeli protests, 430,000 take to streets to demand social justice. Up to 300,000 take part in Tel Aviv, 50,000 in Jerusalem, 40,000 in Haifa, and Israel's biggest ever demonstration. Reporting Sunday, 4th of September 2011, quote, Saturday's demonstrations followed 50 days of protests that have rattled political leaders and led commentators and analysts to ask whether a new social movement would transform Israeli domestic politics for the next generation. The movement, which has the support of I'm still quoting the Guardian, which has the support of about 90% of the population, according to opinion polls. 90%. Began when a small group of activists erected tents in Tel Aviv's prosperous Rothschild Boulevard in protest at high rents and house prices. Tent cities mushroomed across the country, and protesters rallied behind the slogan, quote, "The people demand social justice," unquote. Continuing to quote the Guardian, among the issues raised were the cost of housing, transport, childcare, food, and fuel, the low salaries paid to many professionals, including doctors and teachers, tax reform, and welfare payments. The government established a committee led by the economics professor Manuel Traubenberg to examine the protesters' demands, which is due to report later this month. And I'm not going to read the rest of it for lack of time. But then, guess what happened? Zionism killed the movement. What did these are my words now, I'm not quoting anyone. What did Prime Minister Netanyahu do? Did he grant the demands of his people? No. He killed the movement by letting the Zionist ideology do its job, demanding that the demonstrators, the Jews at least, act, quote, patriotically, i.e., support their billionaire-controlled government in the fight against the real enemy, Palestinians. When Hamas fires its rockets onto Israeli non-combatant civilians, it greatly helps Israeli leaders such as Netanyahu to control the rebellious Israeli working class. Netanyahu killed the movement with Zionism. Here's how. The Saturday, September 4th, March of the Million took place shortly after an attack on August 18th, in which Palestinians killed 8 Israelis, and Israel responded with an air attack. In response to the Palestinians' attack, quote, protest organizers decided that the demonstrations planned for that Saturday would still go ahead, but as silent candlelit marches without speeches or music. From this point on, movement spokespeople's statements began to pander directly to sentiments of vulnerability and patriotism. This is not my words, but it's another online source. Fear of the real enemy, Palestinians, began to demobilize the movement this way. And I have more evidence to report on this, but for lack of time, I'm going to skip. But the point is this: despite the huge participation and support for this movement, it did not win its demands. As the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reported and admitted 5 years later about the effect of the demonstrations in an article trying to put a positive, successful gloss on them, Haaretz reported, quote, it may not have changed the fact that those who led the government then are still in charge today. It didn't even change Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's basic way of thinking about the economy and society. And it didn't change the relative amount spent on civilian social services as a percentage of GDP. These have all remained as they were, unquote. Now I'm speaking. The Israeli billionaire ruling class knows that as long as Israeli working class Jews think that the government that controls is protecting them from the real enemy, Palestinians, then they will not mount a serious challenge to the power of that billionaire ruling class, despite the serious grievances they have against it. Okay, here is assertion part 2 that I'm making. Israel's government for decades has been funding Hamas and working to keep it in power in order to make the Palestinian boogeyman enemy maximally frightening, as the October 7th, of course, did in spades, but as Hamas's long history of overt terrorist violence aimed at killing non-combatant Israeli civilians, i.e. suicide bombings, rockets aimed at civilians in towns such as Sderot, also did. I prove that Israel's been funding and working to keep Hamas in power and explain the reason for it in an article that I linked to, again, with mainstream sources. And now I'm just going to read one little source instead of reading them all for lack of time. This is from Forbes magazine, you know, that marginal, radical, anti-establishment rag, right? Forbes, on January 16th, 2009, reports, quote, incredibly, Israel also supplies Hamas with cash. It began transferring truckloads of cash to Gaza after Hamas's violent takeover of the territory in June 2007. The first transfer of more than $51 million delivered in Israeli shekels was purportedly to strengthen the influence of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in the Gaza Strip and pay the salaries of 35,000 Palestinian Authority employees, then allegedly loyal to him. Among those employees, however, were Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas-appointed prime minister in Gaza, and Mahmoud Zahar, Hamas's foreign minister. Zahar prides himself on many successful terrorist attacks against Israel, and his position regarding Israel is clear. Quote, all of Palestine, every inch of Palestine belongs to the Muslims, unquote, he has said. If the goal was to strengthen Abbas's position, this is Forbes magazine, not me. If the goal was to strengthen Abbas's position, the cash should have been delivered to him in the West Bank city of Ramallah. From there, he could have transferred the money to Gaza, as he has done in the past, and claimed credit for it. Okay, that's the end of the Forbes magazine quote. Now, some so-called experts, such as Professor John Mearsheimer, I think most people here know all about him. So he's a highly respected academic of the realist school, critical of the neocons, but nonetheless very much in the in crowd of American establishment. Some so-called experts, such as Professor John Mearsheimer, in a talk given on May 15th, 2024, which I linked to, argue that the reason Netanyahu supported Hamas was because he and Hamas both oppose the two-state solution, in contrast to the PLO, and runs the Palestine Authority, which supported it. Netanyahu thus wanted to have Hamas prevail over the PLO, according to Professor Mearsheimer. The problem with this explanation is threefold. First, Israeli support for Hamas was ongoing even back when Ehud Olmert was prime minister from 2006 to 2009, which, by the way, is when that Forbes magazine article was written. And Olmert was adamantly in favor of a two-state solution. And I could quote him, but I'm skipping over it. You can read it in my article. So the Israeli government was adamantly for a two-state solution while it was funding Hamas. So it's hardly the case that they were funding Hamas to try to, weaken the power of the Palestine Authority, which was supporting the two-state solution. The second problem with Mearsheimer's argument, as Netanyahu himself explains in this May 14th, 2024 video, just a few days ago, the prime minister only opposes a two-state solution before the defeat of Hamas, when that solution would enable Hamas to be in power in the Palestinian state and to control a military force capable of threatening Israel. But he goes on to say he does not, in fact, want he goes on to say that he does, in fact, want there to be a Palestinian state, which is a two-state solution. He wants the state to have political power to rule over its residents, just not with the power to have a military force that could threaten Israel. Well, none of the governments proposing a two-state solution support the Palestinian state having a military power that could threaten Israel. So Netanyahu is basically for a Palestinian state. So Mearsheimer's contention that Netanyahu supported Hamas because Hamas opposed the two-state solution makes no sense. Why would Netanyahu support Hamas because of its opposition to two-state solution when his fear of Hamas controlling a Palestinian state is the only reason he opposed the two-state solution going into effect before the defeat of Hamas? And the third problem with Mearsheimer's explanation for why Israel funds Hamas is this. Hamas does not, in fact, oppose the two-state solution. There's an AP news article from April 25th, 2024, which says, quote, Hamas official says group would lay down its arms if an independent Palestinian state is established. And then it goes on, but I'm not going to read it, but it's in my article, the next few paragraphs in that article. Okay, jumping ahead to my assertion number 3.
Now, wait a second, John. Okay. So here's the deal. How much, I mean, this is your wrap up, because we've gone too long. And how many more assertions after 3 do you have? You just have 3 assertions. So you make a summarizing. Here's what we need to do. We need to make a summarizing statement, and then
Okay,
pitch
I'll
the
do
conversation.
that. I'll do that. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, so the assertion number 3 is that the early Zionist leaders who became Israel's leaders never were concerned with the welfare and safety of ordinary Jews. They opposed rescue efforts of Jews from the Nazis during the Holocaust because these rescue efforts did not advance the Zionist leaders' goal of obtaining a Jewish working class of their own to get rich and powerful off of in Palestine. That's what they meant by having a state of their own. Okay, I'm skipping over the evidence. There's lots of evidence for that, but I'm skipping over it. The last part of my assertion, the ruling American billionaire plutocracy supports Israel's violent ethnic cleansing project because it creates a Muslim freedom-hating boogeyman enemy that it uses as pretext and for control, because it enables anti-democratic pro-U.S. governments in the Middle East to divert anger of their own people against Israel, because it furthers U.S. rulers' divide and rule strategy for controlling the American have-nots by falsely framing the conflict as the Jews versus the Palestinians, and thereby pitting good people who support Israel against good people who support the Palestinians. Notice that both of those groups agree that Israeli violence is for the purpose of keeping Jews safe. One group says that they oppose that violence even though it's for that noble purpose, and the other group says it supports that violence because it's for that noble purpose. The fact that the noble purpose is a lie is never expressed by virtually anybody. The government censors it, the mass media censors it, and even the anti-Zionist organizations censor it because they get money from big money that makes that big money conditional on them not telling the truth about the purpose of Israeli violence. They're allowed to talk about the evilness of it, but never the purpose, the anti-working class, including anti-Jewish working class purpose of it. They never say that. Hence, the movement fails and good people are pitted against each other. Well, I'll stop there because I just want to say that if we're going to build an egalitarian movement to make the world the way it ought to be, with positive values of equality and democracy and mutual aid and truth and fairness prevailing over the opposite values of the ruling elite, we have to defeat the ways that they pit us against each other. And that means identifying the key lies that enable them to get away with it. And in the case of Israel and Palestine, the key lie is that the purpose is to keep Jews safe, the Golda Meir BS lie. And we need to refute that directly by explaining what is the purpose and showing that the key purpose is to enrich the billionaires, to enable them to get away with oppressing the not just the Palestinians, which is obvious, that's obvious, but also the Jewish have-nots inside Israel, which is not at all obvious. And it's the latter that wins over the people like my upstairs neighbor and my colleague, Michael. And if we don't talk about the oppression of Jews by Zionism, we won't win those people. We won't build the movement that can win like the South Africa anti-apartheid movement did, and we'll lose. And I don't want to lose.
John, thank you for that representation. I'm going to take away the spotlight from you. And I suppose we have some questions up. Now I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to say that this is the end of the formal session for our Truth Action Project on Gaza and Israel. We had an encyclopedic presentations from 3 powerful presenters, and this will be discussed on Friday at our campfire. So for the purposes of, we will stick around and chat, but for immediate purposes, I am going to end our recording and take some hands. But here is the end. Thank you for being here.